Well now, are you huddled up in bed, blanket pulled to your chin? Then let's begin. This story is an old one, about greed, fairies, and the price of asking for more than your share. So make yourself comfortable. This may follow you into your dreams. The Farmer's Curse. In the foothills of County Clare, back in the 1800s, lived a widowed farmer named Eamon Daly. He wasn't a bad man. He wasn't a good one either. Just one of those grey sorts. Kept to himself and trusted no one but his cows. His small stone cottage sat beside a crooked stream where the fog lingered like a second skin and the sun often forgot to visit. One morning, while out mending a low stone wall on the edge of his land, Eamon struck something hard in the soil. It wasn't a rock, it rang, like metal. He dug fast, hoping for old treasure or tools, but instead he unearthed a twisted iron ring embedded in a flat stone. Now, any sensible man would have left that alone. Iron in the shape of a ring buried in a fairy-crossed field, it's bad business. But Eamon wasn't known for his sense. He heaved the ring with both hands, and the stone shifted. Beneath it, a hollow opened, and from it came the sound of faint music. Tin whistles, pipes, fiddles. Before he could think any better of it, Eamon was falling. He landed on moss, soft as a feather bed, and around him a circle of small figures, all pale as milk and dressed in green. One stepped forward. Her eyes were silver, her voice like the wind through a crack in the wall. "You've crossed the ring, Eamon Daly. That makes you our guest." He opened his mouth to protest, but the music swelled. It rolled into his ears, dulled his tongue, softened his bones. He couldn't speak. He couldn't move. All he could do was listen. "You found our ring," she said, "and now we owe you a boon." Eamon, when he found his voice, wasted no time. "3 wishes," he said. "That's the rule, isn't it?" The silver-eyed woman tilted her head. "It's not a rule," she said, "but we are bound by old ways, so 3 you shall have." And just like that, the moss beneath his feet became firmer. The circle of Fae began to sway in rhythm, and the air grew heavy with the scent of elderflowers and smoke. "For my first wish," Eamon said, standing taller than he had in years, "I want gold, enough to last me forever." There was a low hum like bees in the earth, and suddenly his boots sank into a pile of shining coins, old coins, heavy and unmarked. "For the second, I want the best land in County Clare. Fertile soils, green fields, the envy of every neighbour." The Fae nodded. "It is done." Eamon thought for a long while for the third. He didn't need more, but he liked the idea of having something others didn't, something untouchable. "I want no man or woman to ever outwit me," he said. "Let no trick take me. Let me always know more than the one before me." The music stopped. Silence. The silver-eyed woman blinked slowly. "You ask for much," she said. "You offered it," he snapped. The circle faded. The moss turned to soil again, and Eamon woke beside his wall, alone, but in his pocket a single gold coin. By week's end, Eamon's life had changed. His fields turned green even in dry weather. His cows grew fat and gave rich milk. A solicitor arrived from Dublin with papers claiming Eamon was now the rightful owner of a vast estate, land that stretched all the way to the sea. He laughed. He bought a new hat. He walked through town like a man who'd never known hunger. But something else had changed. At the market, when men tried to strike deals, Eamon spoke before they did. When a woman tried to sell him apples, he listed every fault in her batch before she could utter a price. He saw lies before they left mouths. He heard half-truths like they were shouted from the rooftops. He was never wrong, and it drove him mad. By month's end, Eamon trusted no one. Conversations became torment. He couldn't bear to be around anyone. Their secrets screamed at him. He avoided mirrors. He slept little. His mind spun endlessly, and then the whispers started. They came from the field behind his house, soft, beckoning, familiar. At first he thought it was the wind, but the wind didn't call him by name. Eamon, he ignored it. Eamon daily, he drank. The voices grew bolder. They told him things, dark things, who'd stolen from him as a child, who'd cursed his father's name, secrets that felt like poison, but he couldn't look away. Each night he stood at the edge of the field listening, and one night he followed. Through the tall grass, over the stone wall, into the bog. The sky was black, the ground wet, but the voices were clear. They told him of a final wish, a hidden one, something he could still claim, a fourth gift. He stepped into the bog. The mud took his boots, then his knees, but he didn't stop. The voices said he was close. They said the curse wasn't complete unless he turned back. And then he saw her again, the silver-eyed fae standing on the far side of the water, still, waiting. "You took more than your share," she said. "I asked for what was given," Eamon shouted. She didn't blink. "With every answer you now hear," she said, "you lose a piece of yourself. The knowing will eat you." Eamon reached for her. The bog took his waist. "You'll never sleep again," she said. The water rose. "You'll never be alone." It covered his chest. "You'll never know peace." The last thing he saw was her smile. The last thing he felt was the mud in his mouth. And Eamon Daly was never seen again. But if you listen, really listen, on quiet nights in Clare, when the wind's just right and the bog breathes like a sleeping beast, you might still hear his voice, telling you what you already know. Now let's drift out onto Loch Derg, where the water runs deep and the light forgets to follow. They say there are places, pockets, where no sun has ever touched the lake bed, and in those pockets, things wait. Let's row out together. Quiet now. Don't wake them. Thomas Dullahan had fished in the southern banks of Loch Derg his whole life. He was 63, bow-legged, and as weathered as the old timber curragh he used since he was a lad. Most mornings he'd row out before sunrise, but this time He left in the dark. No stars, just a sky that looked bruised. He passed Holy Island, said a quiet prayer out of habit, and drifted into the centre of the lake. The water was unusually still. Not calm, still, like glass that didn't know it was water. Not a bird, not a ripple, only the soft creak of wood and his own breath, louder than it should have been. He cast his line. The fish never came, not even a nibble. Thomas looked down over the side. The moonlight cut the top of the water, but below that, black. The kind of dark that felt solid. Then, a ripple, small, measured, like a hand brushing against the underside of the boat. He leaned in. The water moved again. Not wind, not fish. Something shifting. He dipped his paddle in, out of curiosity, and it was pulled. Not hard, just enough to say, "We see you." Thomas let go of the paddle, watched it drift for a second before it vanished completely, like it had been yanked straight down. He didn't move, he didn't breathe, and then he saw them. Faces, just below the surface, thin, grey, and soft-looking like cloth soaked in river silt. Eyes wide and milky, no pupils, no emotion, just hunger. They didn't rise, they didn't splash. They just hovered under the boat, watching, silent, unblinking, waiting for something. Thomas didn't scream. He didn't have it in him. He sat still, barely blinking as the boat began to turn slowly in a circle. The water ghouls were circling now, not swimming, floating, just under the surface like they were a part of it. Each pass they got closer. One brushed against the hull. The wood hissed, not cracked, hissed, like steam off stone. Another rose enough that the top of its head crested the water, then slid back under without a ripple. He grabbed the emergency oar and began to row, hard, fast, sloppy. Each stroke splashed, and behind each splash, movement. They didn't like the noise. They sank back, for now. Thomas made landfall near Mount Shannon, ran up the grass bank, fell, scrambled up again, panting. He didn't tell anyone what he saw, not at first, but people noticed. He wouldn't fish anymore, wouldn't go near the lake, wouldn't talk about the water at all. A few days later, a neighbour found his old currach on dry land. The wood on the bottom was scorched, as if burned from underneath. But there was no fire, no heat, just water. And sometimes when the lake's quiet and the moon is weak, people say they see faces just below the surface, drifting where the shadows gathered thick, waiting for another Thomas. This story is about a man who inherits an old farmhouse in Offaly. In his grandfather's trunk, he finds a photo of a local man, barefoot and smiling in the bog. But that same man, years later, killed his children then vanished. The story picks up the moment the grandson moves in. This tale is called The Photograph in the Trunk. Conall Rafferty inherited the house from his grandfather, God rest him. It stood just outside Ferban, where the fields turn to bog and the mist forgets to leave. He hadn't planned on staying long, just a few nights to clear the place out. The house had a smell, old wood, turf dust, and something else, something sour. He found the trunk in the upstairs room. Inside were letters, rosary beads, a wedding sash, and then a photograph, black and white, curled at the corners. A man standing barefoot in the middle of a bog, trousers rolled up, smiling wide. The name scrawled on the back, M. Shaughnessy, 1934, before he lost it. Conall asked around the next day. Turns out Mick Shaughnessy had lived just up the road, worked turf, had 6 children. Then, one night, he snapped, took a hatchet to 4 of them, vanished into the bog, barefoot, was never found. They say the other 2 children still don't speak to this day, and they say Mick's boots were found inside the house, but his footprints weren't. Conall tried to sleep, but the wind scraped at the windows like branches that weren't there. The house settled loudly. At 3 in the morning, he woke to a sound, like someone thumping a wet sack against the side wall. Steady, soft, repeating. He walked out into the narrow hallway. No lights, just the moon leaking in through the gaps in the curtains. The far wall, opposite the stairs, was damp. Nothing unusual for a house like this, but halfway up he saw it, a footprint, not a shoe print, a bare, muddy footprint, pressed flat against the wall. Then another, higher, then another, heading upward, not dripping down, dripping up. He didn't sleep that night. Come morning, the footprints were gone. The wall was clean, dry even. He told himself he'd imagined it. Bog gas, maybe, or that sour smell twisting in his head. The next night, same hour, the sound returned. This time, it was a thump. It was a squish, followed by a slap, over and over. Conall didn't go out to the hallway. He lay still, waited, and then, slowly, he heard it above him. The same wet footfalls, soft, slow, slapping their way across the ceiling overhead. He stared up into the darkness and thought he saw it, a long, wet footprint pressed against the plaster above him. Then another, and another, crossing over the bed. Connell left the house the next morning, went straight into town. He asked around again about Mick Shaughnessy. An old woman at the shop said, "Did you check the back field? That's where the turf cutters saw him last." So he did. It was mostly flooded now, soft, spongy earth with scattered stumps of cut turf long abandoned. Near the centre of the field, half sunk, was a wooden cross, unmarked, tied together with wire. Beside it, 2 bare footprints, fresh, one heel still sinking. He left without looking back. The final night he planned to leave, had the bags packed, horse and cart ready, but something in him wanted to face it. He sat in the upstairs room where the trunk had been, only a candle burning now, waiting. At exactly 3, the wind stopped, the silence pressed in, and then the footsteps on the floor, on the wall, on the ceiling. They walked in a slow circle above him, as if pacing. Then they stopped, directly over the mirror. He looked in, saw his own face, and behind it, a second face, smiling, barefoot, covered in muck, and still holding the hatchet. And now the story of the man who walked Slieve Bloom. In the faint glow of an oil lamp, the schoolteacher made his way along a narrow, misty path in the Slieve Bloom mountains. The evening was soft, the world wrapped in a quiet hush, as if the land itself were preparing for a long, slow sleep. Every detail seemed to resonate with the steady ticking of time, the creak of an ancient wooden sign, the gentle patter of rain upon distant leaves, and a whisper carried on a faint wind that drifted across the hills. The teacher's breath grew heavier, each exhalation slow and deliberate, as though he were being invited to lay down his worries and just drift. Somewhere in the shadowed distance he thought he heard soft footsteps, a rhythm as measured as his own heartbeat. It was a sound both subtle and persistent, like the distant rocking of a forgotten candle. Even though the path was empty, the sound seemed to beckon him further, as if guiding him into an ancient secret of the mountain. Wrapped in his warm woolen cloak, he paused to listen. The evening was still, the only movement being the gentle sway of the trees, their limbs tucked beneath the weight of the mist. It was then he remembered an old village tale, a legend of a solitary wanderer, forever bound to the hills, a presence both comforting and eerily unsettling. In that quiet moment, the school teacher's senses sharpened, and he wondered if the land was whispering lullabies of rest or warnings of secrets best left unspoken. Each measured step forward would blur the line between the waking world and the realm of dreams. The next evening, the school teacher left the classroom later than usual. A low fog had begun to settle along the narrow trail back to his cottage, curling around the hedgerows like thin smoke, blurring the way forward into a gentle grey haze. He pulled his cloak tighter, the damp clinging softly to his skin. The air was still, not even a breeze, just the quiet hush of the mountain holding its breath. And yet, there it was again, footsteps, not loud, nor hurried, just there. They came not behind, but from somewhere beside him, just out of sight in the thicker brush, the same slow cadence as his own. Whenever he stopped, they stopped. Whenever he started, the soft crunch of movement resumed. There was something almost soothing in the rhythm, measured, low, and steady, like the ticking of a clock, or the beat of a lullaby meant to rock a child to sleep. He tried to tell himself it was the echo of his own movement, the sound bouncing strangely in the hollow folds of the valley. The locals had warned him not to listen too closely to the hills. The mountain has a mind of its own, one man had muttered over a pint. Best not to follow any sound that walks with you. But the schoolteacher was a rational man. He pressed forward, the soft dampness of the trail sinking beneath his boots. The lantern he carried flickered in the growing mist, casting faint shadows on the stone walls that lined the path. One of those shadows paused just a beat too long. He blinked, eyes a little heavier now from the day. When he looked again, it was gone. Ahead, the trail forked, one path leading home, the other winding up toward a ruined stone chapel he hadn't noticed before. And as he stood there, the stillness deepened. No wind, no birds, just the waiting. And one more step, not his. Soft, close, deliberate. He didn't look back. Instead, he turned slowly onto the path home, the weight of the evening settling over his shoulders like a heavy blanket. Somewhere beside him, the footsteps resumed, never rushing, never stumbling, but always just far enough away to stay unseen. By the third night, something in him had shifted. Not panic, not fear exactly, just a quiet pull, like the feeling of being watched through half-lidded eyes. The days passed in a blur of chalk and quills, children's voices and dusty sunlight. But in the evenings, it was as though the mountain itself waited for him, just beyond the last school bell. He took the long way home, not because he had to, but because the chapel path had begun to call to him. The ruins were older than the village, perched on a mist-covered ledge that overlooked the valley. The locals didn't speak of it. When he asked, they would only glance away and mumble that it doesn't sit right up there. Still, curiosity is a gentle thing when it grows slowly like ivy. The path twisted sharply, climbing into trees whose branches pressed low as if trying to keep secrets. The air grew colder, the kind of cool that curls into your sleeves, quiet and unnoticed, until you feel your bones settle under its touch. The chapel appeared from the fog with no warning, just a broken archway and the faint suggestion of walls. The teacher stood at its edge, lantern held low, the flame flickering against the damp stone. There were no birds, no insects, only the sound of his own breathing, and again that step. But it came from inside the chapel this time, a soft, single thump, like someone placing a boot gently on the stone. Then nothing. He whispered, "Hello," but it came out more like a sigh. The fog seemed to press inwards at the edges, hushing even the sound of his own voice. He stepped beneath the arch. Inside, the floor was uneven, covered in moss and old leaves, but in the center lay a curious shape, a flat stone, too clean, too bare for something so long abandoned. He reached out, fingers brushing the top. It was warm. Behind him, a breath. Not wind, a breath. Close. He turned quickly, but the chapel was empty. Just the walls, the fog, the echo of something that might not have moved at all. He didn't remember walking home, only the rocking motion of his feet, the soft trail behind him, and the growing heaviness in his eyes. By the time he reached his cottage, the lamp was nearly out, the flame reduced to a dim whisper of light. The teacher sank into his chair, boots still on, and stared into the hearth. The coals had gone low, the warmth a memory more than a comfort. But still something in his house creaked, as if it too were shifting into rest. And somewhere far below, in the dark bones of the mountain, the chapel breathed again. The next morning brought no sun, just the pale grey light that makes it hard to tell if it's dawn or dusk. The teacher's boots were damp by the hearth, though he couldn't remember bringing them in. On the windowsill, a thin film of mist clung to the glass, as though the fog itself had come to rest a while. He returned to the chapel before dusk, not with purpose, more like he was being drawn, as though something had gently placed a thought into his mind and let it take root. He told himself it was curiosity, a scholar's nature, a need to understand. But the air was heavier now, and the fog thicker. Each step was swallowed by the trail. There were no sounds, no animals, no branches snapping. Not even his own breathing seemed to echo back. And still he felt watched. At the chapel's arch he paused. His lantern glowed softly, casting gentle light onto the same stone as before, the clean one, the one that had no moss, no lichen, just cold, bare surface. But tonight, something was different. Carved into its face, just shallow enough to be missed in poor light, were letters, old ones. He leaned closer, the flame flickering as he traced them with his eyes. Dullahan died 3rd of November 1873, the one who followed. He whispered the name aloud, though he didn't know why, as though reading it made it settle deeper into his chest. And when he said it, something answered, not a sound, more like a presence, a weight to the air, the soft pressure of someone standing behind you just beyond reach. He turned slowly and saw nothing, just the fog and the edge of the chapel falling away into the dark woods below. He exhaled slowly, heavily. Then another footstep, just one, inside the chapel this time, close and deliberate. He raised the lantern high. In the far corner, the shape of a man began to form. Not sudden, not sharp, just a low thickening of shadow, a coat, a hat, his own figure, it seemed, only somehow older. The teacher stumbled back, and the shadow did not move, but he heard something, not spoken loud, a voice that lived in the walls, in the fog, in the spaces between sound. You've stepped where you shouldn't linger. He ran. The path blurred beneath his feet, the trees seeming too close around him like ribs. The lantern bobbed wildly, casting sharp slashes of light and shadow along the trail. And behind him, not footsteps now, but the sound of breathing, as though someone walked just at his back, matching his pace. He didn't stop until he reached the cottage door. He slammed it shut, threw the bolt, and slumped to the floor. The hearth was still warm, the chair still rocking slightly, though no one had been there, and as he sat in the hush of his cottage, eyes wide, chest heaving, he noticed it. On the inside of the door, scratched faintly into the wood, letters, just visible in the lantern's tired glow. The one who followed. The days passed, but none of them clearly. The school children noticed first how the teacher spoke softer, how his eyes never quite met theirs. He would pause in the middle of sentences, staring toward the window as though listening for something only he could hear. He stopped walking the long way home, stopped lighting the fire some nights. The cottage remained cool, the corners filling with shadows that came earlier and stayed longer. Every night he heard it, the creak of a step, the breath just behind him, and always that feeling. Not fear, not anymore, but a kind of sleepy gravity, a soft pull from the bones of the land. Then came the night of thunder. Began the low roll far away across the valley, barely louder than a breath. Rain tapping against the thatch roof, soft as fingers. The wind curled at the corners of the windows, and the candlelight leaned to one side as though it too wished to leave. The teacher sat by the hearth. He had not changed his clothes. His boots were still on. In his lap rested a letter, blank. He had picked up the quill hours ago, but never dipped the ink. He simply held it loosely, like a thing forgotten in a dream. Then the knock. Not loud, just 3 soft taps. He didn't move, not at first, just closed his eyes and let his shoulders fall like he'd been waiting. He rose slowly, calmly, crossed the room, drew back the bolt. The door swung open, and there was no one there, only fog. But he stepped forward, 1 foot, then another. The cool air pressed against his skin like a blanket turned cold. The wind curled around him, whispering not in words, but in memory of a name, a date, a shadow in a chapel. They found the cottage the next morning. The hearth had long gone cold. The bed was made. His coat hung neatly by the door, but the lantern was missing. So was he. They searched for days, through briar and stone, field and hill, but the path to the chapel was never found. Some said the trail had been swallowed by a slide of the earth. Others whispered it had never existed in the first place. But every so often, when the fog gathers thick over the Slieve blooms, villagers speak of a dim light moving through the trees, a soft step on stone, the faint echo of a lesson once taught long ago. And somewhere above the valley, the mountain settles again, still, heavy, and watching. A quiet family in Connemara begins to hear a sound in the dark, one that drifts from the bog at night, and calls only to those marked for sorrow. This is the Cry Beyond Derryclare. They say that when a Banshee cries, she cries for the dying, not for those already gone, and that when the wind carries your name in the dark, it's best not to answer. It was the year 1904, early autumn, and the hills around Derryclare were soaked in a damp kind of stillness. Rain had passed through the day before, leaving the peaty soil soft and the air heavy with that rich, earthy hush. Thomas and Maureen lived alone in a stone cottage tucked near a bend in the bog road. A quiet place, the kind where time moves slower, like a clock ticking beneath a blanket. Their son, Aidan, had taken ill weeks earlier. The doctor came once from Clifton and never returned, likely knowing the journey wouldn't be needed again. That evening, the wind came up from the valley, low and wandering, and with it a sound like someone humming from far off, soft and wavering. Thomas paused by the hearth. "Did you hear that?" he asked. Maureen nodded slowly, fingers curled around her mug. From the back of the house, Aidan stirred in his bed, his voice thin. "There's a woman singing outside," he whispered. The air inside grew still. No one answered. Later, the sound came again, not humming low, but a cry, as if someone far away was grieving softly into the wind. Thomas stepped outside. The valley below was quiet, the trees unmoving, but as he turned back to the door, he saw a figure just at the edge of the path, not walking, not standing, just there. When he blinked, she was gone. That night, Aidan's breathing deepened, then slowed. Maureen tucked him in tighter, her hand resting against his forehead. The warmth there had begun to slip, like water draining through old wood. Then, through the silence, came a voice, barely audible, as if spoken by the air itself. "Aidan." Maureen froze. The candle beside the bed flickered and went out. The darkness that followed felt hollow. Outside, the wind whispered low, and the back door creaked, not opening, just settling. Footsteps in the grass, slow and deliberate. Moss came in pale-faced. "She never cries for the living," he murmured, "only when the soul's halfway gone." They sat by Aidan's side through the night, holding his hand. His breaths came like a dying clock, each slower than the last. And from somewhere high in the trees above Derryclare, the Banshee cried again, this time not in warning, in mourning. Morning arrived quietly, the sky dim and soft, as though it too felt the weight of what had passed. Maureen hadn't slept. The cottage was hushed, and even the sheep beyond the fence seemed to step carefully. On the hill behind the house, a single strand of silver hair clung to a thorn branch, fluttering in the gentle breeze. The moss said nothing. They buried Aidan that afternoon beneath the hawthorn tree, the one his grandfather always said marked the edge of things. That night, the Banshee did not cry. The house settled. The fire burned low, the embers sighing in the hearth. Maureen wrapped herself in Aidan's blanket. The scent of him was still there. She blinked, eyes heavier now. Outside, the wind passed softly through the stones, and just for a moment, she thought she heard a sound in the grass. Not weeping, just breathing. Now, let's journey into another tale. After forcing a leprechaun to give up his gold, a man grows rich, but cruel. And in the stillness of a soft, moonless night, something begins to follow him, and it does not want his gold. This is the sound of hooves on quiet earth. In the hills west of Roscrea, just beneath a dip in the earth, where the fog gathers like wool in a bowl, there lived a man named Lorcan Kearney, who once caught a leprechaun and wrung a promise from its trembling lips. He got his gold, as they say, but not the joy. No. Lorcan's heart grew harder than the coins he hoarded, and colder still. He sold off his land, let the crops wither, and built a stone house taller than any near it. The hearth burned day and night, but no one ever saw smoke from the chimney. Those who knew Lorcan said his eyes had changed. Not mad, exactly, but distant. He sat up late, alone in his still house, staring out the darkened window towards the hedges. Even in calm weather, he claimed he heard hooves, a low clop, clop, muffled like someone riding barefoot across the moss. He asked the priest to bless his land twice in 1 month. The priest, hesitant, said it wasn't the land that was cursed. It was what he had done. One evening, as the wind whispered through the trees, Lorcan sat in his parlour with a brandy glass, sweating in his hand. The fire had burned low, and the room was heavy with heat and silence. Then he heard it again, the hooves, slow and steady, closer. He stood, but his legs felt heavy, as if the floor had risen around his boots. Outside, the wind had stopped, no rustle, no owl, just the far-off ring of iron on earth. When he opened the door, the road was empty. But down by the end of the drive, past the blackthorn hedge, something shifted, a glint, not firelight, not lantern, a shine like wet bone. And from the shadow of the trees emerged a rider, tall, silent, headless. In one hand he held a human spine like a whip, limp and glistening, and in the other, nothing. Lorcan didn't breathe. His mouth was dry, the air stuck in his throat like dust in an old chimney. They say if the Dullahan speaks your name, your soul will not reach sleep, not ever. But Lorcan swore the thing never spoke. It only looked, with no head to look from. It stayed until the fire behind him dimmed to embers, and when he blinked, slowly, heavily, it was gone. Only the marks of hooves remained, pressed deep into the clay like something too heavy for this world had passed through. After that night, the air around Lorcan's land felt thick. The wind no longer moved through the reeds. The birds wouldn't land on the sills. He stopped eating, stopped speaking, just sat in the chair by the fire and watched. Every night, the same sound. Hooves, some closer, some further, but never gone, and always he was the only one who heard them. Eventually, he boarded the windows shut, nailed iron horseshoes above the threshold, dug pits around the house. Still, the creaking came at dusk, the sound of a rider circling the walls, never knocking, never stopping, simply waiting. Then, one night, the house was quiet. Not still, just quiet. Like the moment before sleep when you're no longer certain whether you're awake. The fire burned low. The wind pressed softly against the shutters. And in that hush, Lorcan began to hum. A small sound, tuneless and faint, like a lullaby remembered in pieces. His eyes blinked slowly, once, twice. The hum faded. The next morning, the front door stood open, swaying gently in the breeze. Inside, the chair was empty. The hearth was cold. But on the floor near the threshold, someone had drawn a circle in ash, the kind used to trap something in or out. Lorcan was never found. Some say he was taken, others say he followed. But the locals, when they speak of it, do so softly, and only once the lamps are low. And if you're ever passing west of Roscrea, and the night feels too quiet, listen closely. You might hear a single hoofbeat, then two, then nothing at all. In the windswept village near the ruins of Kilcrea Abbey, a lonely man sat in an empty pub one storm-slick night, until a quiet stranger dealt him into an old game best left forgotten. This is the quiet game at Kilcrea. The rain came soft and steady, tapping like fingers on the windows of O'Shea's pub. Long closed for the evening, yet still glowing dimly from within. The hearth was low, the coals hissing quietly, and the only sound besides the storm was the faint ticking of an old clock above the bar. Seamus Hanley, a man not known for company, sat hunched in the corner by the fire. He wasn't drinking much, just nursing the warmth in his hands, staring at the deck of worn cards he shuffled by habit. There was something old about him, not in age, but in the way he sat, like he was waiting for something that never came. That night, something did. The door creaked open slow, letting in the cold mist and a man draped in dark wool. water slipping quietly from the brim of his hat. No name was offered, and none was asked for. He sat opposite Seamus, like he'd been invited. The stranger's voice was soft and low, more a breath than a sound. "You deal, Mr. Hanley." Seamus didn't recall telling him his name, but something in him settled heavy, like a stone in still water. He dealt the cards, a game called 31, old as the hills and older still when played with silence between turns. The stranger's eyes never blinked, his face barely moved, and though he didn't speak, Seamus found himself saying things he hadn't told another soul in years. He spoke of how he'd once been a good man, and how wealth had turned him mean, how the farm thrived but his family left, how he drank alone most nights, and how the gold in his pockets never made his bed feel less cold. The stranger nodded, slowly, as if listening to something far older than words. By the third hand, the man said, "Shall we raise the stakes?" Seamus smirked, a tired one. "And what would a man like you want from the likes of me?" The stranger turned a card over with a quiet tap, like a knuckle on old wood. "Not much, just what's left." There was weight in those words, not menace, just stillness, like the air had stopped moving. Seamus laughed, but it didn't sound like himself. "All right," he said, "deal again." The final hand was played slowly, cards folding like autumn leaves falling. The storm outside had settled into a hush, and the only sound was the crack of the fire. The stranger laid his cards down with a quiet, decisive grace. 31, the perfect hand. Seamus blinked. His own hand showed 28. The stranger stood slowly and offered no farewell, just tipped his cap and walked through the door, which closed gently behind him. Seamus sat there for a good long while. The cards still lay on the table. The fire had sunk to embers. He felt no fear, just an odd, drowsy ache, like something important had quietly ended. Eventually, he rose with effort, knees stiff, and wandered to the door. He opened it. The rain had stopped. The village was quiet as a grave, but in the soft earth outside, where the man's boots should have left a trail, there were hoof prints, heavy, deep, and facing away into the dark. In a quiet Irish valley, an old man is visited by a strange rook that seems to be watching him. Day after day it returns, silent, steady, and patient. What begins as a harmless curiosity slowly draws him into something older and far from forgotten. This tale is called The Rook on Barrow Hill. They said the old man never had much cause to leave the valley. He kept a few goats, tended the graves up at Kilbride, and walked to the village once a week for bread and tobacco. No one knew his first name. Folks just called him MacWraith, though none could say if it was his surname or just the way he carried himself, as if memory itself followed him. It was near the end of October when the Rook appeared, a sleek, black thing, sharp-eyed and silent, perched on the chimney as MacWraith lit his evening pipe. It didn't call, it didn't fidget, it only stared. Day after day it came back, perched at the gate in the morning hush, on the fence post come dusk, always watching and always silent. Most would have shooed it, but MacWraith had lived long enough to know that some things don't respond well to being pushed. One soft morning, he woke before dawn to find the Rook standing in the centre of his quiet kitchen floor. Not a single feather disturbed, no door ajar, no window broken, just the Rook, as if it had always been there. Then it turned and walked outside, and MacWraith, he followed. Out through the gate, past the meadow, over the dry stone wall, and onto Barrow Hill, the place locals never walked, not because of any old curse or buried bones, just something quieter than that, a silence that seemed too thick to be natural. The bird led him past the boundary zone, across the mossy ridge, and finally to a small ring of rowan trees, twisted by time and wind, and there, beneath the tree, it stopped. MacWraith looked down. A human tooth lay half buried in the soil. Then a second. Then the corner of a rusted buckle. He'd seen this place before, in a memory he didn't own. A field mechanic in 1921. A burial that wasn't quite proper. A man left behind because the priest had fled. A shallow grave, covered too hastily. And that's when it clicked. The Rook wasn't leading him to his death. It was leading him back. Back to a promise he had made in the thick of the blackened hands in retreat. A vow mumbled through blood. I'll come back for you. Only he never did. The Rook tilted its head, as if hearing something far away. Then it blinked once and flew off, quiet as a breath. When the villagers found MacWraith's body 2 days later, he was seated at the base of the rowan, hands folded, the rusted buckle resting gently beneath them, peaceful, as if he had simply lain down for a moment's rest. But the thing that troubled them was this. Dozens of black feathers lay around him in a perfect circle, and every one of them had turned grey. fire's low now, and the wind has quieted. Let your eyes drift, and your breath slow. You found a warm place here, stories waiting in stillness. Come back tomorrow night. We'll be waiting.